Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. Today is Wednesday, December 10th, 2025. At the time of this recording, it's about 11 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm here. My name is Sebastian. I'm here with my co-host, Josiah. Hey, Josiah.
Hey, Sebastian. How you doing?
Doing well, man. As I understand, this is our last regular episode of the year, right?
Should be, yeah.
Okay.
You're getting ready to leave soon. I don't remember if the audience remembers why. Maybe you can tell them. But next week we'll have Zach, our CEO, joining us. Then we'll take a week off for Christmas, and then we'll be back with an episode from Israel after that. So some exciting stuff ahead of us. But this will be our last Sebastian and Josiah episode for a few weeks.
Yeah, that's exciting. You're going to Israel, and I was supposed to go. And I don't know if we said it, but we'll say it now. Look at this beautiful room. If you're watching us on YouTube, this is our future baby's room, God willing. My wife and I are expecting our first child within a couple of weeks. So hopefully the baby will not come during the recording of this episode. But yeah, this is our baby room, and that's why I won't be in. Well, next week you'll be with Zach. It's going to be a special episode with our CEO. So thank God for that. And hope you guys are ending your semester well. Those of you who are still in college, finalizing your semester, and those of you who are not in college anymore, I hope you're having a good start to your holiday season. So in the last several weeks, there have been debates about Israel within the conservative and the Make America Great Again movements. And they have exploded in the open. We've been covering this about some internal rift between conservative people or so-called conservative people within the MAGA movement. Within the last week, President Trump released what is called a National Security Strategy, the NSS, which defines American policy for his administration. In Qatar, meanwhile, this happened. So the NSS was released last week. And at the same time, right now, there is a forum in Qatar called the Doha Forum. Doha is the capital of Qatar, where various leaders met to discuss regional issues and say a bunch of interesting things, including one of our favorite guys, Tucker Carlson, once again, has been invited. He got invited to interview the prime minister there. And there were some really interesting statements made in American foreign policy towards Israel, which Josiah will cover with us. The conflict over American foreign policy and the U.S.-Israel relationship seems like it's going to get a lot worse, the conflict itself, not the relationship. So let me say that again. The conflict over the relationship seems like it's going to get a lot worse. So let's discuss. That's what we're here for. I'm so grateful, Josiah, that you're covering this for us. There's so many things we could talk about right now, but this is not to be missed. The United States put out a very important guiding star for foreign policy, which is, I think, appreciated. That, I studied political science, and all I heard about when I was in college was the United States has not had a clear foreign policy for a very long time, since the Cold War, basically. So I think this is an interesting proposal. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the national security strategy and what does it say about the Middle East. It's it's funny, you write a paper. This is a paper on the whole world. So what does this paper about the entire world say, Josiah?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's, to your point, it's not just a paper on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. It's this document that's basically outlining a strategy for U.S. foreign policy around the world with sections on every major region of the world. So, it's a fairly extensive document to read through in that respect. For the purposes of what we're going to be focusing on today, which is U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, you really could focus just on pages 27 through 29. Kind of skim the rest of it, you'll get the gist, but you don't need to necessarily read it in depth in order to understand what some of the shifts are in U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East. That being said, I did want to zoom out for just a second and make an observation about this NSS, and then we can dive back into, U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East and especially towards Israel. It's a very interesting document in the sense that, it has drawn quite a bit of scrutiny and even some criticism, of course, from different administrations past or different individuals who worked for administrations past and now work for various think tanks, whatnot. That's to be expected. Of course, President Trump's foreign policy has not been popular even since his first term. What I found interesting about the document as a whole is that it's not entirely consistent with his national security strategy or foreign policy as outlined in his first term, which means that it's changed a little bit between the first and second term. And To push the observation even a little bit further, one of the things that stands out about this document is that even within this version of his national security strategy, the second term version, there are a few contradictions still. So it's not an entirely coherent or cohesive document that is without contradictions. They do still exist in this document. And I think what that says about the current administration is that its foreign policy is not totally settled yet. And if you've been following the news closely over the last year, it's been pretty obvious there's a pretty, at times, intense infighting within the administration, different departments and different agencies over what is U.S. foreign policy and what is specifically President Trump's foreign policy for the United States. It doesn't seem like the answer is entirely clear yet, that they have been able to resolve some of those conflicts within the administration. And probably what it suggests or what it signals is that this fighting is going to continue because this is President Trump's second term. The debate is not just about what President Trump's foreign policy is, but what U.S. foreign policy will be after he leaves office, because there will come a day when the Republican Party and the current administration, those individuals who are currently working for President Trump, might have to work for someone else. And things might again change in the future. So there is room for, and I think need to continue debating what U.S. foreign policy will be, not just now, but also in the future. That being said, to zero back in on the Middle East and Israel, there are a few shifts that are pretty significant trends. They don't seem like the kind of trends that are just going to go away after President Trump, but seem to be, a notable shift that's probably here to stick around for a while in terms of how the U.S. thinks about the Middle East and its relationship with Israel. I'll give you a few examples. Number one, the document makes fairly clear that the Middle East, in the eyes of the United States, is frankly a little bit less critical than it used to be, particularly during the Cold War or during the early 2000s during the War on Terror. What are the reasons given for that? There really were two big reasons. One, there's a view that the War on Terror no longer poses as significant a threat to the U.S. homeland. It, of course, has been some time since 9/11, and it's natural that over time people would view terrorism or the repeat of events like 9/11 as somewhat less of a threat than they were in the past. Of course, it's debatable whether that is a prudent course of action or not. But in the eyes of the U.S. administration, what they're viewing as some proof of that concept is things like the relative defeat of ISIS. It exists still, yes, but in a much less threatening form. Not complete dismantling, but pretty thorough, you know, dismantling of Iran's terror proxy network over the course of the last 2 years since October 7, 2023. And as they look at the landscape, their view essentially is that terrorism is less of a threat to the United States than it was several years or even a couple of decades ago. The second major observation they're going to make in terms of why the Middle East is going to be a little bit less critical is because the U.S. is much less dependent on energy derived from the Middle East, on oil, for example, received from the Middle East. The U.S. is now a net energy exporter, meaning that it actually produces more than it needs, or at least produces more than it has to import from other countries, and is able to actually start exporting or selling some of its energy production now. So that makes it much less reliable on countries in the Middle East for their oil, their energy, and in turn makes the Middle East a little bit less of a priority. This makes a lot of sense given the big picture of this national security strategy is that the United States wants to pivot to other parts of the world that it views as posing greater threats, especially East Asia. The growing threat of a rising China is frankly just more of a concern for the U.S. administration right now than anything happening in the Middle East. That being said, the Middle East is a source of opportunity, especially in terms of investment and trade. There were several mentions of the idea of trying to capitalize on the economic opportunity that the Middle East represents. And at the end of the day, I think that the basic premise of the new national security strategy in terms of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is that stability is important. Engaging in these very disruptive endeavors like regime change or nation building or completely remaking the Middle East is not really what President Trump thinks is important. What's important is creating a stable status quo that allows for economic trade, investment, and opportunity to flourish, because that's how he views the Middle East right now, is an opportunity to essentially build economic growth, not as an opportunity to completely change the status quo or engage in some very adventurous U.S. foreign policy. This really has been a key theme of President Trump's since his first term.
Yeah, and I think that's very clear. Trump sees the Gulf states, especially, right, as a source of financial investment into the United States. And There's so much more interesting stuff that we could say about this. For instance, I found the focus on Latin America to be very appropriate, very timely. But that's this podcast is not about Latin America; it's about Middle East. But I just think that that's interesting. That I do find it concerning that Iran, for a long time, has built a kind of a underground network in Latin America through its Hezbollah
Hmm.
outreach. Lebanese immigrants in Argentina to Venezuela. And that's something to keep watching. I'm sure in Mexico, I'm sure a lot of stuff gets through the border or had gotten through the border before. So all that is very interesting. But of course, let's focus about the Middle East, which is our concern here. Let's talk about the U.S. Israel relationship then. According to this NSS, the National Security Strategy, what are the implications for the United States relationship with Israel?
Well, there's a few things I think that stood out from this document. Number one, that it still explicitly names Israel's security as a U.S. foreign policy priority or as a strategic interest. And that might seem a bit odd because there aren't many other countries listed throughout this document that receive that kind of attention or commitment to an ongoing alliance. In fact, the national security strategy in several places calls into question various historical alliances that the U.S. has built or committed to. So it stands out as an exception to some of the other bigger trends within this national security strategy document. I think the best way of understanding that is that the United States views Israel as part of the reason why, if you're sort of reading between the lines about the improvements in the region's overall security in this document, most of those the United States attributes to Israel. The reason why the war on terror is not as significant a threat is because Israel is the one who has thoroughly dominated many of Iran's terror proxy organizations across the Middle East. So the United States views Israel as a key ally or key priority moving forward because it allows the United States basically to outsource most of the ongoing maintenance required to continue winning the war on terror without necessarily having to commit large numbers of resources and especially troops, soldiers
Yeah.
to the Middle East. So that's a big note that really that's going to be has been and will continue to be, I think, a very important part of the US Israel relationship is this understanding that the US is able to outsource the war on terror, for lack of better terms, to Israel, at least to a certain degree. Some of the other things that I think this document suggests is that there is, for example, an emphasis on expanding the Abraham Accords, building more peace deals, and not just peace deals, but the kinds of peace deals that create, again, this stable environment for trade and economic growth. President Trump doesn't just want to end conflict in the Middle East. He wants to find a way to integrate the Middle East in various ways that create more opportunities for trade, investment, and economic growth. And that's really one of the key sort of drivers, I think, behind his intent to expand the Abraham Accords is that he can create more value if he's able to integrate the various economies in the Middle East, not just create trade between the United States and individual countries in the Middle East. Now, what does that mean for Israel necessarily? Israel's value add is going to shift over time if it wants to maintain a positive relationship with the US administration, especially if it reflects current trends or if it reflects Trump's foreign policy. If it wants to remain relevant under the kind of doctrine laid out in this document, then number one, it has to continue winning the war on terror. Number two, it's going to have to begin thinking in more business terms. It's not just about shared values between the United States and Israel. If Israel wants a strong relationship moving forward, and I think you do see recognition of this reflected in recent remarks by Israeli leaders as well, especially the prime minister, among others. It's going to have to start thinking in terms of how do we create economic opportunity for the United States? How does our relationship benefit the United States in material terms as well? Because frankly, that is how the US administration is starting to think is in terms like that. And Israel will have to also think in terms like that if it wants to communicate the value of the relationship to future US administrations. So it's interesting. I think it does fly in the face of some traditional doctrine about the US Israel relationship and why it's important. But from a realpolitik standpoint, that seems like where the conversation is starting to
Well, at the same time, as the national security strategy was laid out, like I said, friends, if you really want to look into that, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. I think for Christians, it's good to be aware of where our country position in the world is, especially since our faith calls for us to have a global vision, right? Jesus did charge us personally to go and spread the gospel to all nations. So I think it's good for Christians to be informed about the world. One interesting thing, for instance, is like the North Korean threat is downplayed in this security strategy. Yeah, Europe is being looked differently. the United States is pivoting to the global south, as they called it, I think. But at the same time, as we said before, the Doha Forum was taking place. So it's a conference in Qatar where Qatar basically hosts all these journalists, all these influencers, all these elites, business leaders, and also the government representatives from all the regional players go there. And one of the persons who was invited was Tucker Carlson. He was invited to interview the Prime Minister, Sheikh Mohammed. So he said a lot of things. I have a lot of comments to say here. Just before I will comment, one preemptive comment that I have about this is if you guys go watch this, it's very interesting how Qatar is trying to position itself as a victim. They're like, poor us, the world doesn't understand us. We are such good people. We're brokering peace. We're investing in the United States. We don't even ask for aid. We give aid to America, and the world just doesn't understand it. If actually the transition between when Tucker Carlson stopped interviewing the Sheikh Mohammed, the transition, so a woman came up and she was like, "Well, that was so interesting. Thank you so much." It's confounding how American opinion about Qatar is so antagonistic when they're just such good countries. Something like this. Basically, Qatar is like, "Oh, poor us. The world doesn't understand us." So I think that was kind of the framing of the mood, or at least what I watched. But please, friends, we watched Tucker Carlson's interview, so you don't have to because it's kind of painful. So Josiah, tell the people, what did Tucker Carlson get wrong this time? Because he's always going to get something wrong. So what did he get wrong this time?
Well, I think there's a couple things that you've already touched on, and I'm just going to give a couple of my observations about things that I think were misleading, historically inaccurate, perhaps, and then maybe we can get into some other observations you have as well. From a high level standpoint, I do think it's important to note, like, what is this forum exactly? It is billed as this sort of gathering of leaders and officials from around the world to talk about major issues related to international affairs. And it is probably accurate to say that it is not just that, but it is also a massive PR opportunity because a country the size of Qatar doesn't really have any business organizing global leaders for conversations about global issues, given its relative size, except for the fact that it has a lot of money and views it as a strategic priority of its own to be in the middle of, if not leading and driving some of these conversations in order to develop its own soft power. So, really, I mean, yes, this forum is about having important conversations about important issues. Yes, I don't want to deny that because there were some very interesting things on the agenda. But also, I think in order to understand some of the complexities of what it means when this forum happens, or why there's certain issues with the way people said things, or some of the things people said, you do have to understand the context that it's also a PR exercise. I mean, it's the Qatari government trying to make itself look better and develop more diplomatic power, given that it doesn't have a lot of traditional hard power because of the size of its country and the way that it's constituted. So that's some important background or context, I think. Now, as far as some of the things that Tucker said during the course of the conversation, there were a few things that were just not true or factually incorrect, but I think there's two things that definitely stand out as being particularly interesting. Throughout the course of the conversation, of course, Tucker was going back and forth about US foreign policy towards the Middle East. He also was going back and forth about US support for Israel and even the Gaza peace plan, things of this nature. There's a lot going on there. But one of the things that came up during the course of his conversation with the Qatari leader was this observation that he made essentially, or he claimed this was a factual historical observation, that essentially no American president, in his words, has ever sided with an Arab state over Israel until Donald Trump forced Bibi, that's the prime minister of Israel, to apologize to Qatar. And
Yeah.
that's just frankly a stunning lack of historical
Yeah.
literacy. Either Tucker Carlson has absolutely no idea what he's talking about, or he's being deliberately deceptive and misleading in terms of the narrative of the story that he's trying to spin. And it makes sense because Tucker's always had, I shouldn't say always, recently has consistently had this beef with Israel about whether it drives U.S. foreign policy or whether U.S. foreign policy shapes the U.S.-Israel relationship in turn, which is arguably the way that foreign relationships are supposed to work. It makes sense that Tucker would argue essentially that Israel's always been, pulling the strings of U.S. foreign policy. And that's basically what he's trying to do with this comment, but it's just not true. If you actually know the history, we'll just think about Egypt, for example. I mean, this is only one of Israel's Arab neighbors, but if you know the history of the relationship between Israel and Egypt, it's absolutely not true. The United States has always taken Israel's side over this neighbor. In fact, repeatedly, in many cases, the U.S. has taken Egypt's side. You go back to the Suez Canal crisis, for example. The United States was livid when Britain and France and Israel invaded Egypt during the Suez Canal crisis in the 1950s, and was very harsh actually in terms of telling them like you have to undo what has been done and get out of Egypt. If you fast forward to the 1967, 1973 wars, in both cases there's going to be strong pressure from the US government not to push the advantage too far. Israel had seized massive military advantage over Egypt in both cases, was on the verge of destroying the Egyptian military completely. And the United States is pressuring them, don't. Like, you have to accept an armistice or a deal and get out before you completely destroy Egypt because the United States needs Egypt, essentially. And this was because of Cold War
Yeah.
politics. It's a complicated issue. Again, if you just know something like the basic history of US foreign policy in the Middle East and how it's related to some of the neighbors around Israel, it's just not true that the United States has always taken Israel's side.
Just
And yet
sorry to
Tucker's out here
interrupt.
arguing that it is.
I want to encourage the audience, if you really want to get into it, because I think it's good for the audience to have this fact and like understand it fully. I would encourage you to read Michael Oren's book on the 1967 war. He has very clear details about this situation that Josiah just described. That's the one that came up to mind. I'm sure it's in many other books, but if you have a lot of time during the holidays, just curl up by the Christmas tree with the 1967 book by Michael Oren. That's Michael Oren. Read about it because I think it's important. So, Josiah, sorry to interrupt you. So, yeah,
Yep.
they're kind of whitewashing history here.
They are. And here's where I'll leave it because I do want to move on, not spend too much time on this one issue that I take issue with. But I would say this: if you want to know more about the history, about what's actually happened, how much support the U.S. has actually given Israel, or in many cases actually withheld from Israel over the course of our relationship, you should check out our Israel Explained series on YouTube. We've got some great videos on there on the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship, as well as relationships between Israel and specific Arab neighbors like Egypt. We'll link to a playlist in the show notes for this episode so you can check it out and learn more about that because, again, a Tucker either has no idea what he's talking about or is lying. Not sure which one it is, but it is important to be educated and know the truth about these issues. One other thing that I want to throw out there that I thought was just odd. Sebastian, you can feel free to weigh in with your thoughts on this one. I'm going to maybe punch this one over to you because I know you have a lot of thoughts and opinions about this one. But Tucker repeatedly made these arguments essentially that I'm free, I'm independent, I never take money from foreign governments, I've taken no money from Qatar, so I can do whatever I want. And he used this as justification basically to and now make an announcement during this conversation in Qatar that he's planning to buy a property in Qatar, buy real estate in that country. And basically what he was saying was, I can do whatever I want. I'm an American citizen. I can buy whatever I want. I can be friends with whoever I want because I am free and independent regardless of who my friends are, essentially. I thought that was odd, but Sebastian, would be curious to hear your reactions to that. Did that strike you as odd? Anything sound off, or does that make sense to you?
I'll be very interested in looking at like having some scrutiny on that transaction. He's saying, I'm buying a house. Is he buying a house? Or is he going to be like, are they going to make it look like he bought a house? Because, friends, politics works this way. Like a lot of people get paid in many different ways. So, Josiah, I think in a second, you should remind us because we did a podcast episode about this a while ago where we mentioned how is it that Tucker Carlson ended up being invited to Qatar early this year, right? To interview Sheikh Mohammed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was, I forget when exactly, but it was within the last year that there was an interview.
He did a tour of like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, I think, and Russia too. And he was invited there anyways. But yeah, I think I was so enraged watching this. I was so enraged, but then after processing, I was like, well, Sebastian, like grow up, be mature. Like it's clear. I hope that smart people will watch this and it's clear to realize that this guy is being invited because he's a useful idiot. He is a person that is asking very self-bought questions. For instance, the Prime Minister of Qatar says something like, people blame us for hosting Hamas. We've been transferring money to help the Gaza people, only the Gaza people. And then Tucker didn't follow up on anything. Again, remember how much he grilled Ted Cruz on following up questions and being rough on questions, but he didn't follow up at all here. Like, oh, can you tell us more about these transparent financial transfers that you made to entities in Gaza? So he doesn't ask hard questions. He doesn't follow up. All his questions are softballs, so the guy can knock it out of the park. For instance, he's like, "If you're such a good country, you've done all these good things. Why did Israel bomb you?" And then people start clapping immediately. So I think it's clear that he's being bought, that he is being invited there because he's gonna not ask any hard questions. And I have a lot more to say, but I want you to keep going because why don't you remind us of how is it that Tucker Carlson got invited to interview him for the first time?
Yeah. Well, this is where things get tricky because I think what you're referring to is the PR firm that was kind of the middleman.
Yes.
Tucker's claim that he doesn't receive any benefits for giving these friendly interviews to world leaders, which, by the way, also included a leader from Iran around the time of the Iran war, which
Right.
was just shocking to most people that you would interview a world leader that we're actively at war with. But I think the argument that he doesn't receive any benefits for this is a pretty squishy one because at the end of the day, no, there's no direct paper trail from the Qatari government to Carlson proving that they have directly paid him for these interviews or things like that. The paper trail that does exist, though, is pretty clear that the Qatari government hired a PR firm to arrange interviews for them, paid a pretty significant amount to that PR firm, and then the PR firm did arrange the interview between Carlson and the Qatari officials. So there's some sort of professional relationship there in terms of whether or not Tucker Carlson is being compensated monetarily, how much he's being compensated. That's not entirely clear. I don't want to fabricate evidence that doesn't, at the moment, seem to be readily available to us in order to make a point. But I think the point that we can make is that there is a professional relationship. Even if he's
Yeah.
not being directly paid for these interviews, there is a professional relationship, a symbiotic relationship where he does benefit from having these controversial stories that he gets to tell in order to please his audience, grow the size of his platform and of influence in exchange for the Qatari government being given these very, strong puff pieces, if you will, or this very positive PR for their country as well. So there's a lot there that you're right
Yeah.
needs to be continue to be scrutinized.
And the fact that they're so defensive about it or preemptive about it just shows their insecurity around it. Like, imagine like you coming home and asking your kid, like, "Hey, how was your day?" "Oh, it was great. It was great. We were good, and we didn't steal any cookies from the cookie jar, and we like, wait, why are you mentioning that? So
Yeah.
nobody asked him, but he's clearly mentioning about this. Just a couple of things that I wanted to mention about him as well. He said, "I admire you as a neutral party." So Tucker Carlson told the Prime Minister of Qatar, "I admire you because you're neutral." That is dishonest. That is just not honest. Qatar owns a media company called Al Jazeera, and they also have another subset of that called Plus, which is not a neutral media machine. It's a propaganda machine, and Qa- Qatar is the biggest funders of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a organization that's increasingly being positioned as a terrorist organization in the United States. I believe, for instance, Governor DeSantis in Florida has recognized the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and I don't know if Trump has done it yet. Has he? But I know he's getting ready to.
That's another complicated issue. So he's not gone so far as to recognize the global entity as a foreign terrorist organization, but he has, if I understand correctly, created new policy which allows or even encourages the US government to designate specific chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization. There is some growing sense that momentum is growing and eventually you might get to a point where more chapters, both in certain parts of the Middle East, but also organizations which operate downstream of the Muslim Brotherhood, even in the US, might be prosecuted for material support for terrorism or for different links to terrorism as a result of this policy.
Yeah. So I think Qatar is the last thing I will call it neutral. Tucker Carlson said, "You're like Switzerland." Well, I just as from a Christian point of view, because this is a Christian podcast, neutrality is not a great thing. We're not morally neutral people. And I think Qatar is definitely not morally neutral, and they're not neutral in policy around the world. So, one last thing before I send it back to you is that the Prime Minister of Qatar said, we spend a lot of money lobbying in the United States, but it's only because we're attacked. Because we're smeared. Like, he says that there are people interested in destabilizing the relationship between Qatar and the United States, and that's why we lobby. But that's silly. Like, the reason why they're being exposed, and I invite friends, as we have done many times, to look at two reports. For instance, the Free Press did a report on how Qatar bought the US. great report, How Qatar Bought the US by the Free Press. And also the Foundation for Defense of Democracies has a paper, I think it's Natalie Econo, who made a report on how Qatar's money has been influenced American universities. So I would say that the accurate timeline is that Qatar has been investing billions of dollars, influencing America through different many ways, and then the American public is finally waking up to it. But he's saying that the reason why they spend money is because they're attacked. That's not true. But Josiah, there are a lot of other lies, like little white lies here. Are there any other things that you want to say about why these little things, these little positionings should be taken seriously?
Yeah, there's a few things I think are maybe worth clarifying in terms of, why do we keep bringing up Carlson on this podcast? Are these little lies important enough for us to keep talking about them, keep coming back to these issues? Because this is now, I forget, it's third or fourth time we've talked about this in the last few months. I think Tucker's going to raise this point himself as well. I don't understand why Qatar gets criticized as much as it does, or why I get criticized as much as I do, why people seem to have it out for me, this and that. Again, sort of playing this victim card that you've already alluded to earlier in the conversation. And I think it's important to just make very clear that Tucker, number one, I think opened himself up to a lot of this criticism by basically playing the card fairly early in this conversation or this debate that he's been in the middle of, that there is some global elite organization, cabal, whatever you want to call it, group of people, even if they're not formally organized, who are buying the loyalty of the US government, suppressing freedom of speech in the United States, and interfering in our media, our national discourse, and our politics. That was frankly, a pretty anti-Semitic argument for him to be making, because he has not been very subtle about the fact that he thinks Jews or Israel, the Jewish state, is behind a lot of this. But for him to be surprised now that he's being criticized for leaning into or enabling foreign interference is pretty hypocritical, I think. And again, I think he really sort of opened himself up to this and shouldn't be surprised that he's now being criticized for his connections to or his ties to these various foreign governments, most of which, Qatar being an exception because weirdly enough, it is considered an ally of the United States, but Russia, Iran, I
A
mean,
major
these are
non-NATO ally, right?
Qatar is, yes, but I think if you look at the bigger picture of who Tucker's been platforming over the course of the last year, it's also major enemies of the United States
Yes.
that he is allowing to speak into our politics and our national discourse. So there is, I think, a very real concern, and it should be a real concern about, is he the one who's actually enabling foreign interference in American politics by platforming people from Russia or from Iran or places that are openly hostile to the United States? I think it is pretty hypocritical to praise the Qatari government, to not ask it difficult questions, to get very close to it and to refer to them as his friends, and frankly, to whitewash in the process many of the various issues that the Qatari government has, which include human rights abuses. I mean, if you want a very cautionary tale in the scope and scale of human rights abuses by autocratic governments, just look at the World Cup and what had to happen in order to make the World Cup happen in Qatar. It's absolutely horrifying. The scale of human slavery that still exists in this country.
Exactly. They built those stadiums using slave labor, and thousands of people died.
Terrible, absolutely terrible stuff. You have, again, Qatari efforts that you've just outlined, for example, to interfere in American politics. I mean, to argue that there's nothing to see here, that the Qatari government is neutral, they're our friends, and they should be allowed to have a voice in American politics, but the Jews should not. That's just hypocrisy. And of course, he's going to be criticized when he starts to contradict himself in these ways. And he shouldn't be surprised when he becomes the center of a lot of controversy. I think it's particularly problematic in the sense that it's not just an intellectual contradiction of his own views. It is also something with real world consequences, in the sense that it allows the Qataris to get away with a lot of things in terms of its human rights abuses, but not just that, also to sabotage American foreign policy. Are familiar with some of what's also been happening at the forum, even outside the Tucker conversation. There were other interviews or follow-up conversations about the Gaza peace plan. And frankly, the Qatari government is in a position right now where they are threatening to either cancel their promises or demand a renegotiation of the deal that they helped to make for a peace plan in Gaza. They are essentially arguing that any delays in the Gaza peace process are Israel's fault. Israel has to withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip in order for the deal to move forward. That was never part of the original peace plan, but they're making new demands that weren't part of the original deal.
And it's concerning that the brokers of the deal, are
Absolutely.
not holding to the deal.
A neutral broker would not be doing these sorts of things. A neutral mediator should be enforcing the deal as is written and should not be making new demands on behalf of one party to the conflict or the deal. That's exactly what Qatar is doing. They're also arguing essentially that Israel, in effect, what they're arguing is that Israel should be punished for lack of progress. Hamas should not be punished for its many violations of the ceasefire. I mean, none of the pressures that the Qatari government is trying to put on people in order to move the deal forward is putting any pressure on Hamas. It's only arguing that pressure should be put on Israel to make sure that the deal goes forward. And Hamas is the one that's been violating the ceasefire since it took place. It's still the fact that we're down to one, but there's still a body of a hostage left in the Gaza Strip. Okay.
Yes.
That in and of itself is a violation of the deal, that body has not yet been returned. But there's no real pressure from the Qataris on Hamas to fix this, only on Israel to fix this. And again, I'm ranting a little bit now, but the point is Tucker is enabling the Qatari government not just to look better than it is, to whitewash its image internationally, but also to directly sabotage American foreign policy because it helped to negotiate this deal in coordination with President Trump's administration and the US government. And now it's going back on the deal and arguing that it has to be renegotiated. And that is going to prevent the Trump administration and the US government from being able to carry out the deal that they negotiated. It's not a friendly thing to do, but Tucker is basically encouraging or enabling them to do this by whitewashing them and making them appear to be neutral when they're not. That's dangerous. And I think that's why all of these little white lies matters, because it's not just about the individual white lies, it's about the impact, the effect, the outcome is that Qatar is allowed to get away with really horrible things.
Yeah, and I wonder at what point we should stop talking about Tucker Carlson, because basically he's just not a serious person. He's just not a serious player. He is just an influencer for hire. But I just want to mention before, so we wrap up, we're about to go into some prayer points on how each Christians respond. I just want to mention some quick things that also came up in this conversation I think is interesting for the public to know. One, they're saying that the Qatari prime minister was saying, we're not paying for the rebuild of Gaza. It was basically like, if we didn't destroy it, like we didn't break it, why do we have to pay for it? That was interesting. He says, we support the stabilization of the region. Like Qatar's whole project in the region is to stabilize the region, which is not true. They fund the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a major destabilization force, so much that they're banned in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in many other countries, because they destabilize the region. Josiah, I wonder what you think of this. He mentioned one little thing, and maybe I'm making too much of this, but he said, the Prime Minister of Qatar said, Trump called us 2 minutes before Israel targeted the Hamas terrorists in Doha. So these are the Hamas leaders who were there, who are terrorists themselves, who instigate terror, who promote terror. And as part of Israel's frustration with the negotiation with Hamas, they wanted to assassinate these leaders, hoping that that will help them move forward. And then I thought that was interesting. The Prime Minister of Qatar said Trump called us 2 minutes before. And I don't think it was 2 minutes, probably like 10 minutes. And as we know, that attack was not successful. They got away with it. So I wonder if Israel called Trump like, hey, we're about to do this right now. We just wanted to let you know. Then Trump calls them immediately, and then they called it the terrorists, and the terrorists walked away alive. Am I making too much of that?
So if what you're suggesting is that the Qatari government is the reason why the Hamas terrorists survived the assassination attempt?
Yes, that's what I'm suggesting.
I don't think so. It's possible, but I think most of what I've read suggests that the reason why they were able to survive is because Israeli intelligence wasn't quite good enough. Now, Israeli intelligence has done miracles over the course of the last 2 years, allowing Israel to take out terrorists across the Middle East. They're not perfect. And this is probably the one case in which they got it wrong. It had something to do with electronics being the main source of targeting, in terms of, you target the room the electronics are in. Leaders didn't happen to be in the room with their electronics because they had left the room to go pray, for example, something like that. It's, a complicated issue, but based on what was reported, it seems like they just missed them by minutes. And it was a result of Israeli intelligence not being perfect about how they were going to find them in the room at the right time, in the right place for the strike. So I don't think I would chalk it up to the Qatari government warning them. I don't think it's likely that the Qatari government would be given a heads up if people thought they would have had time to prevent the strike from being carried out successfully. But there are, I think, other reasons why that Trump did decide to give them a heads up.
Well, Josiah, let's move into how we should respond and some prayer points. I'm actually going to get started and then I'll let you finish it up. I have some very specific prayer points. One, I think we need to pray for wise people advising the President of the United States. I know this is from our point of view, this is our country, this is where we live. I just think the President Trump has probably a lot of contradictory forces trying to influence him. And for the sake of the world, for the sake of our position as the United States, history will teach us that there are many times where presidents engage with international parties that ended up being a mistake historically that burnt us in the long term. So the president is putting a lot of his chips on his relationship with Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And I think those are two different players, but because of our financial needs, he's trying to retain this relationship with Qatar. And I think Qatar is not a friend or any of their antagonistic partner. And long term, that could be a problem. So we need to pray that he will be advised correctly. This is a quick point, but I don't want us to keep missing the long term point, friends. We need to pray for the next president of the United States. President of the United States could be Vice President Vance, and he has a closer relationship to Tucker Carlson than Trump does. Vance is advisor is Tucker Carlson's son. So Tucker Carlson's son works for Vice President Vance, who could one day be the president of the United States. And finally, I think we should continue to pray for this peace plan. I do think is a major achievement that the president of the United States was able to get all these different parties, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, Europeans, to agree on this Gaza peace plan, and it's kind of holding for now. Hamas obviously is violating it, but I heard some like liberal commentators criticizing Trump. It was basically like, and these are Trump's peace partners. Qatar is Trump's peace partner, and I think that's credit to Trump. He has made, like, if you heard the comments that Saudi Arabia made about Israel, that Qatar is obviously making about Israel, there are people who don't like each other, who don't like Israel, and somehow the president of the United States was able to get them all in one room and agree to this thing. And I think that's credit to the president of the United States. So we need to pray for that peace plan, that it will hold, that will continue to move along and hopefully make the region a better place than it was on October 8th, 2023. So those are my very specific prayer points. How do you think we should respond and pray about this?
Yeah, so I'll kind of work backwards through some of the issues that we've discussed today, starting with Tucker and then get back to this idea of, US foreign policy, global strategy, that sort of thing. As far as Tucker goes, I think one thing that I do want to be clear about, because it might seem like we've been picking on Tucker a bit today, and over the past few months have done so a couple different episodes. He's a person who is important for a couple of reasons. One, he has a lot of influence. So yes, he says things that we don't agree with, or we think are factually incorrect, but that doesn't change the fact that he does have a lot of influence. People do listen to him and take seriously what he has to say.
And he claims
It
to be a
is
Christian, so
right, and that's ultimately what I want to focus on in terms of how Christians respond to him. Is one, you take him seriously because he's an incredibly intelligent person who is very influential, and if you want the truth to be heard, then you have to wrestle with the level of influence that he's been able to acquire and figure out how to respond to that. At the same time, he is a Christian, and I think as Christians, we should care about his well-being. Strongly disagree with a lot of what he's saying. I think a lot of the time he does not have good intents or motivations for some of the inaccuracies that he reports or he broadcasts. But at the same time, I do feel for him in the sense that he claims to be a fellow Christian, our brother in Christ. I think we should be praying for him. I think we should be praying that he is able to reconcile and figure out how to reconcile his Christian faith with a lot of the lies, unfortunately, that he has been telling, and ultimately that he finds some restoration within his soul of the truth, his ability to see, understand, and speak the truth, and that his faith would be first and foremost for him, not his pursuit of influence or prestige or whatever else it may be. I think that's a matter of just praying for the welfare of his soul as a person and as someone who claims to be a fellow Christian. I think that's really important, something we can't be forgetting. Even when we disagree with him and we argue with and about him, I think we do need to be mindful of that aspect, that he is a person with a soul we should be praying for. To go back to this idea of a national security strategy, I think there's a couple of things that stand out to me in terms of how Christians think about this. Number one, our government can and should think in grand strategic terms. If the purpose of government is to punish evil and uplift the good, then there's a lot of evil in the world and a lot of opportunities to uplift the good. it's not a simple world that we live in. It's a very complicated world, and it's good for our government to think in complex, grand, strategic terms about how to accomplish its purposes. I think we should praise the government for its efforts to do that. It's also true, I think, that at times the thinking in those terms can obscure the human impact of major decisions. It can sort of treat humans involved in more abstract terms. And we should be careful as Christians to leverage our voices and our advocacy in those moments to remind the government that there are real human consequences for the major consequential decisions that they have to make, and they have the authority and the responsibility to make. Ultimately, I think as Christians, we should be praying that God continues to use human governments, including our own, the American government, for his purposes, that humans can flourish as a result of the work that our government does, and that humans ultimately may also know God better as a result, because government should, in an ideal world, be a reflection of God's sense of justice and compassion. And I think the goal would be that our government can find a way to reflect those ideals or those characteristics of God's, the kind of thing that I think we should be praying for as we read about and think about the strategy or the policies that our government is pursuing.
Josiah, that was so helpful. Thank you so much. I feel even convicted myself. So definitely will be praying for Tucker, a person that I really don't like and I find to be very damaging. But you're right. We got to pray for him as well. So thank you for that reminder. Friends, I personally would like to wish you all a Merry Christmas. I hope this season of just brings you closer to the Lord, brings you closer to Jesus, our King, who was born, who became man to save us from our sins. So praise God for that. And please look forward to next week's episode with our CEO, Zach and Josiah. And then we'll see you guys after that in the new year. Shout out to our producer, Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay, for making this podcast possible. This is our episode 38. We're already thinking how we're going to celebrate episode 50 coming up next year. So thank you, Lindsay, for producing this podcast. And we'll see you guys at the next episode. Thank you. Bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.